Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Justin Herring, and I lead the Cybersecurity Division at the New York Department of Financial Services. So we're very excited to have you with us as we mark the 5th anniversary of DFS's cybersecurity regulation. I think we've got a great program here, and we're happy to be able to bring you this symposium. Our goal is really to provide practical information about cybersecurity and cyber risk. We, of course, were very proud of DFS's leadership role in cybersecurity. When our cyber regulation became effective in 2017, it was really the first of its kind for the financial services industry. DFS's cybersecurity regulation has since become the model for many of the regulations that have followed, like the FTC's amended safeguard regulations and the NYSE model cyber security regulation for state insurers, state insurance regulators. Right? They say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So we take the widespread adoption of our regulatory approach as a compliment. Now, unfortunately, cyber risk has really grown since our regulation went into effect. Right? Today we see cyber risk as the single greatest risk faced by the financial services industry. Right? There's risk to companies and their ability to maintain their operations, protect their data. There's risk to consumers, right, who depend on financial services companies and who entrust those companies with their sensitive data. And finally, there's risk of a systemic attack or a systemic problem that could really bring down or cripple the financial industry by taking out multiple institutions at the same time. I think that's been our view at DFS for a while now. And when we first took that view, it was a forward-leaning kind of view. I think since then, it's become almost conventional wisdom among regulators and much of the industry. For instance, last year, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, said that the thing that was most keeping him up at night was the possibility of a cyber attack that undermined the stability of the financial system. And of course, recent events, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have reminded us of the possibility of cyber as a weapon for nation states and the risks that poses. So with that as the backdrop, today is the first day of our 3-day symposium, right? The second day will be on April 26th, where the focus will be on the human factor, leadership, governance, and diversity. We'll also be hearing a keynote from our superintendent, Adrian Harris. And the third day of our symposium will be May 24th, where we will put the spotlight on small business. We'll be partnering with the Global Cyber Alliance to focus on practical steps that small businesses can take to be more secure. So I'd encourage you all to mark your calendars and follow our website for updates. Today, we're focused on the evolution of cyber risk and the evolution of cyber regulation. We have a terrific lineup today. We have 2 panels of experts and a short presentation from us from DFS on how we are working to modernize cybersecurity supervision. So we're going to start off with a panel that I'll be moderating, focused on the past, present, and future of cyber regulation. And after the break, we'll have a short presentation from William Peterson. Will is an assistant deputy superintendent here at DFS. He leads our team of cyber examiners and is responsible for building out our cyber supervision program. He'll be discussing our work to incorporate modern risk assessment tools into our supervisory process. Right? Examinations are the cornerstone of how financial services regulators supervise. That's been true for a century, and it's not going to change. Right? But as a regulator, we also want to keep up with innovations and developments in cyber risk assessment that are coming from the private sector. And whether it's companies that are trying to assess the risk of their vendors or insurers who want to write cyber policies, there's been a lot of progress in assessing third-party cyber risk, and we want to take advantage of that. Finally, we're going to close today with a panel that's focused on the key cyber risks of 2022. That panel will be moderated by my colleague, DFS's CISO, Robert Francis. So before we jump into our first panel, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about DFS's work on cybersecurity and our perspective on the future of cybersecurity regulation. Since joining DFS in 2019, I've had the tremendous privilege to build and to lead our cybersecurity division. Right, just as our cyber regulation applies to all of New York's financial services companies, the work of our cyber division cuts across the whole of the financial services industry. Right, our primary goal is to improve cybersecurity across the financial services industry and sometimes beyond. right? And to do that, we focus most of all on our cybersecurity regulation and promoting full and effective compliance with that regulation. To do this, we use all the tools available to us as a regulator. So we set policy, we write guidance, we work with our colleagues across the department on improving our ability to assess cyber risk through supervision and examinations, and sometimes on enforcement actions to address significant violations of our cybersecurity regulation. So on my first day at DFS, the cyber division was a division of 1, but today it has grown to about 30 staff. It includes attorneys, specialist cybersecurity examiners, cyber intelligence professionals, and DFS's own internal information security team. Look, I'm biased, but I think it's a terrific team, and I have to point out that we are hiring, right? If you'd like to help build a more secure future and take a try at public service, I truly believe there is no better place than DFS, right? In my very biased view, DFS is something of a Goldilocks regulator. We're big enough to matter because New York remains the financial capital of the world, but we're also small enough for a regulator to be relatively nimble and to innovate, right? I don't think it's an accident that DFS has been a leader in several areas, not just cyber, but also areas like crypto and climate. So if you're interested in joining us, I would encourage you to check out the careers page on our website. We've got postings for several different kinds of cyber professionals, or people who would like to be involved, become cyber professionals. And we would certainly welcome all the passionate and dedicated people that we can find. So next, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the future of DFS's cyber regulation specifically. As many of you are probably aware, we're working on updates and revisions to our regulation, right? As proud as we are of DFS's cyber regulation, this is an area where a lot has changed in the last 5 years, and our regulation should be updated to account for those changes. Of course, we're still working on those revisions, so nothing is final yet. So I'm not really in a position to discuss the details today. We will, of course, be publishing proposed amendments for notice and comment, and I have no doubt we'll get lots of terrific and vigorous feedback from the industry. But even though I can't discuss the details, I thought I would highlight today some of the areas that we are focusing on. That focus, our focus, is driven by what we are seeing working and not working in the industry. Right? We are fortunate to have really very good information about what's driving the risk in our industry and what's reducing that risk. Right? Since our regulation became effective, we've followed up on hundreds of cyber incidents that have been reported to DFS, and we've examined the cybersecurity programs at hundreds of financial services companies. So combined with insights from experts inside of DFS and outside of DFS, we've just developed a strong understanding of what is actually driving meaningful reductions in risk. And that understanding is what's driving our focus as we look to amend our regulation. So in terms of talking about amending the regulation, I think maybe the best place to start, though, is with what's not going to change. Right? Our regulation requires a comprehensive risk-based cybersecurity program that covers the core NIST framework areas. The foundation of it is a comprehensive risk assessment and then implementing written cybersecurity policies to mitigate those risks. The regulation is primarily a principles-based approach that focuses on governance, right? And this, I think, is what has allowed it to be durable and flexible enough to cover the whole of the financial services industry, which includes very different business models, banks, insurance, crypto, payments companies, and more. Companies of very different sizes, thousands of small businesses in and around New York, and on the other end of the spectrum, global multinational insurance companies and banks. And also our regulation, I think, has proved flexible enough to deal with many of the changes that we've seen in cyber risk since 2017. And so that core risk-based, principles-based approach is not going to change. Instead, we are looking to build on that foundation, right? So for instance, we are considering adding explicit requirements to have policies in critical areas like remote access and vulnerability and patch management. I think for reasons that are obvious, probably given where we are in 2022. We are also taking some of the existing requirements and making them more detailed in areas like asset inventory. Asset inventory is really the foundation of any cybersecurity program. It's very hard to defend what you have unless you know what you have. And we are also focused on very much on the governance requirements, right? Looking at how the board and the C-suite oversee the cybersecurity program. And this includes our certification requirement, right? I think the requirement that the company certify to the department each year that it's in compliance with the cybersecurity program is arguably the single provision that has driven the most change in the regulation. Having to certify to your regulator concentrates the mind and usually ensures a thorough review of the program. The requirement is that a senior official certify to DFS, and at different companies that we see that sometimes means different people. So we are considering defining better who is required to make the certification, perhaps tracking the approach in the Sarbanes-Oxley certifications, where it's the CEO and the CFO. So the analog here would be the CEO and the CISO. As far as specific risks that we are focused on, obviously the explosion in ransomware and the scourge that ransomware has become is something that we are focused on addressing too, right? And that could include clarifying our incident reporting requirements around ransomware. We published a guidance last year on ransomware risk and the controls that we see as the most effective at reducing ransomware risk. That's also, those controls we're also looking at for possible inclusion in the regulation. You know, our current regulation has very few requirements for specific controls, right? There's encryption at rest and in transit, and there's also multi-factor authentication for remote access. Even in 2016, when the reg was first being drafted, I think these controls were viewed as essential minimum controls that every organization should have. I think it's fair to say that in 2022, the list of essential minimum controls that every organization should have is a bit longer than that. And if you want to see what we're thinking about, I think you can look at some of the recent public statements that we have put out. I mentioned the ransomware guidance. We also published a guidance last year focused on multi-factor authentication. More recently, this year, DFS published a statement on risks associated or arising from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That statement covered a number of areas like sanctions, but also covered cybersecurity with a particular focus on incident response planning and business continuity. So I won't rehash those guidances today, but I'd encourage you to take a look if you haven't seen them already. And if you're interested in where we are focused as we look to revise those regs, the written statements we put out over the last year will give you a pretty good sense for where we're looking. So finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about, I'd like to end on what is hopefully an optimistic note. I think that cybersecurity can seem very daunting, right? Especially for folks that aren't full-time cybersecurity or InfoSec professionals. It's a relatively new area for most of us. And the media coverage, as it does, there's nothing wrong with this, but the media coverage tends to focus on the most spectacular or sophisticated or damaging cyber attacks. And those things taken together can sometimes lead to a sense of fatalism or a sense that this is a problem is overwhelming us, right? But the truth is the overwhelming majority of cyber attacks that your organization is going to actually face are cyber criminals using a handful of known techniques over and over again. And those techniques have known counters. If you've ever heard the term cybersecurity hygiene, those are the core cybersecurity controls that will counter the techniques that cyber criminals most commonly use. Right? Now, cyber risk will never be zero. Cybercrime is never going to go away any more than like crime generally is going to go away. But as a practical matter, every organization out there can protect themselves from 90+% of the threats they're actually likely to face on a daily basis. So I'd urge you to approach this problem with a sense of optimism, right? It's true that the internet was not designed with security in mind, and we've been playing catch up for a couple of decades now. But there's nothing inevitable about that trend. We can reverse it. And an important part of that is trying to change our culture and change our approach so that security considerations are not just grafted on after the fact, but something that's considered at every stage. And that's something that you can contribute to, whether or not you're an InfoSec or a cyber professional. That's also what a lot of organizations have started to do. And I think it's how we can change the trend line and help to build a more secure future.